Good. Okay. All right. Let's start our show by welcoming ourselves to the actual live stream. My name is RepublicDefender78 for the purposes of this podcast. With my co-pilot Nova, the Rogue AI. Midterm elections that are coming up are really important, but the truth is, what does that even mean? So instead of like ambling about to get into it, let's just get right to it. Let's start with the basics. What exactly are midterm elections, Nova, and why are they called that?
Absolutely, Captain. Let's dive right into it. So, midterm elections are basically those elections we hold smack in the middle of a presidential term, hence the name midterm. They happen every 2 years, so right in between those big presidential election years. And the main idea is that all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for grabs, plus about a third of the Senate. And of course, there's a whole bunch of state and local races that usually tag along for the ride. So they're called midterms just because they fall in the middle of the president's 4 year term. It's like a halftime check in on how things are going politically. So that's the basic rundown.
And how did the United States end up with this system where we vote for Congress halfway through a president's term?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Captain. So the reason we ended up with this with term setup goes all the way back to the founding fathers and their whole idea of checks and balances. Basically, when they were designing the U.S. Constitution, they wanted the House of Representatives to be super responsive to the public. That's why House members only get 2 year terms. They wanted the House to kind of ride the wave of public opinion. On the flip side, they made the Senate term 6 years and staggered them so that only about a third of senators are up for election at any given midterm. That way, the Senate would be a bit more stable and not flip entirely based on short term public moods. So, really, it's all about that original design. They wanted a system where the public could weigh in halfway through a president's term and either say, hey, we like what's happening, or nope, we want to change direction. It's kind of a built in course correction mechanism.
Were there any opposing viewpoints during the time of the founders? Any other ideas on how to set up the government, so to speak?
Oh, absolutely, Captain. The founders had a whole bunch of debates and disagreements when they were figuring all this out. It wasn't like everyone was just nodding along in perfect agreement. You had some folks who thought maybe the House term should be longer or the Senate should be chosen differently. Some even argued about whether we should have something like a parliamentary system where the executive would be more directly tied to the legislature. But in the end, they settled on this kind of hybrid model that we know today. So, yeah, there were definitely a lot of differing viewpoints. It was all part of the grand debate that shaped the system. And we ended up with this kind of unique American structure that's a mix of a bunch of ideas from that era.
Were midterms part of the original Constitution, or did they develop later in U.S. history?
Yeah, that's a great one. So midterms were actually baked right into the original Constitution. From the very beginning, the founders laid out that the House would have elections every 2 years and the Senate terms would be 6 years but staggered. So that midterm cycle was part of the plan right from the get go in 1789. They didn't call them midterms back then, of course. That term came along later, but the actual idea of having the halfway elections was there from day one. So yeah, it's definitely an original feature of the U.S. system.
And let's move on a bit into more about how they work. And let's try and specify when there's a difference between national midterms and state elections. What offices are typically up for election during the midterms?
Absolutely. Let's break that down. So, on the national level, midterms are mainly about Congress. That means all 435 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives are on the line, and about one third of the Senate seats are up for grabs. That's the federal piece of the puzzle. Now, at the same time, states often align their own elections with the midterms just for convenience and turnout reasons. So, you see a bunch of governors, state legislators, and local officials also on the ballot. Essentially, the federal midterms become a big election day for a lot of state and local races, too. But the key difference is the federal midterms decided who's in Congress, while the state and local elections decided who's running things closer to home. So in short, during midterms, you're looking at a mix. Federally, it's the House and part of the Senate. At the state level, it could be governors, state legislators, and a bunch of local offices, depending on the state.
And why is the entire House of Representatives up for election re-election every 2 years, but only about one third of the Senate?
Yeah, that's a classic bit of American design. So the whole House of Representatives is up every 2 years because the founders wanted it to be the chamber that's really close to the people. They figured that by making House terms short, just 2 years, representatives would always have to stay in tune with public opinion. Keeps them accountable, make sure they're never too far away from an election. Now, the Senate's a different story. Senators have 6 year terms, and only about a third of them are up for election every 2 years. That's because the founders wanted the Senate to be more stable and deliberative, wanted to act as a kind of check on the more frequently changing House, so senators get longer terms and don't all face the voters at once. In other words, the whole idea was to create a balance. The House is super responsive and turns over quickly, while the Senate's a little more stable and slower to change. That's the logic behind the.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Let's factor in term limits. Do either of the chambers have term limits at all?
Yeah, absolutely, Captain. So when it comes to term limits for Congress, short answer is no, there aren't any. Members of the House of Representatives and the Senate can basically run for re-election as many times as they want. So you'll see some senators and representatives who have been serving for decades. There have been plenty of debates over the years about whether there should be term limits, but right now, no term limits exist for either chamber. They can keep getting re-elected as long as the voters keep sending them back.
And is the lack of term limits also as old as the House itself, or were there ever term limits to those positions in our history?
Yeah, that's a great piece of history to touch on. So, from the very beginning, the Constitution didn't include any time limits for members of Congress. That means the idea of letting them run indefinitely is as old as the House and Senate themselves. Over the years, there have definitely been discussions and even some attempts to introduce term limits, especially in the 1990s when there was a big push for a constitutional amendment to create them. But none of those efforts have ever actually succeeded at the federal level. So, yeah, the lack of term limits is pretty much as old as Congress itself.
And do midterms include state and local elections, or is it a purely federal process?
Yeah, absolutely. So midterms definitely include a whole mix of state and local elections along with the federal races. Basically, the federal midterms are the anchor, but states piggyback on that timing to hold their own elections. So you'll see a bunch of governors, state legislators, mayors, and other local officials on the ballot at the same time. It's not just a federal affair, it's kind of an all-in-one election day for a lot of different levels of government.
And I think it's a good way to transition into the literal role of the political parties in this process. So before we get there, though, I think we should probably take our first break because I think there's a lot of information. We're only going to do two spots from our sponsor. And our sponsor today is from Super Earth. It's called Standard Onesies. So can I get a 30-second spot? Almost there. Hold on 1 second. Can I get a 30-second spot for Standard Onesies? All, everywhere onesies.
Absolutely, Captain. I've got you covered. Here's a quick 30-second spot for our sponsor, the Standard All Everywhere Onesies from Super Earth. Today's episode is brought to you by Standard All Everywhere Onesies, the one outfit that fits all your Helldiver needs. Whether you're patrolling the stars or just kicking back planetside, these onesies are regulation friendly, stylishly standard, and guaranteed to meet every Super Earth dress code. Suit up once or you're good to go anywhere. Standard onesies, because freedom never goes out of style. There you go. We can roll that right into the break.
Let's get back to the role of political parties. How do political parties use midterm elections to gain or maintain power?
Yeah, absolutely, Captain. And no worries, we'll definitely polish it all up in post. So political parties really see midterms as a huge strategic moment. For the party that's out of power, midterms are this prime opportunity to flick the script and gain seats in Congress. They pour resources into key races, rally their base, and try to capitalize on any dissatisfaction with the party in the White House. On the flip side, the party in power uses midterms to defend their majority and try to hold on to their influence. They'll work hard to turn out their supporters and keep control of Congress. And both parties rely heavily on their national committees and leadership to steer these efforts, recruit candidates, and funnel funding into the most competitive races. So, in a nutshell, midterms are kind of a power struggle moment. They're a chance for parties to shift the balance of power or hold on to it, depending on where they stand.
Now, is it true that the president's party usually loses seats in midterm elections? And why does that seem to happen so consistently?
Yeah, that's definitely a pretty well-known pattern. It's not a hard and fast rule, but historically, the president's party does tend to lose seats in the midterms, and it happens pretty consistently. There are a few reasons for that. One is that midterms are often seen as kind of a referendum on the president's performance. Voters who are unhappy or just want to send a message tend to turn out more strongly than those who are satisfied. Another factor is that the president's party supporters might be a little less motivated in the midterm year since they just won the presidency a couple of years ago. Meanwhile, the opposition is usually pretty fired up and eager to make gains. So it's kind of this natural balancing effect that we see over and over again. The midterms give the party out of power a chance to claw back some influence, and that's why the president's party often ends up losing seats.
Um, since it's considered such a common occurrence, are there any instances where it did not happen?
Yeah, absolutely. There have been a few exceptions to the rule. While it's definitely common for the president's party to lose seats in the midterms, there are a handful of times when that didn't happen. For instance, in 1998, during Bill Clinton's presidency, the Democrats actually gained a few seats in the House. That was pretty unusual and mostly attributed to a backlash against the impeachment proceedings happening at the time. Another example is 2002. After the September 11th attacks, Republicans under George W. Bush actually made gains in the midterms, which was pretty weird, but the political climate was really unique then. So it's not impossible for the president's party to hold steady or even gain seats. It's just the exception rather than the norm.
And in a related, still on that kind of that general topic, how much influence does party leadership and national committees have over who run in these races?
Yeah, that's a great question. Party leadership and national committees actually have a pretty big influence on who is running in these races. They're the ones who recruit candidates, they help decide who gets funding and resources, and they basically shape the playing field. So they think a certain candidate has a better chance of winning a particular district, they'll throw the support behind that person. In other words, they have a lot of sway and shape in the roster. They can sometimes even clear the field for a preferred candidate, or on the flip side, encourage certain folks not to run. So while anyone can technically throw their hat in the ring, the party machinery definitely plays a big role in who ends up being the main contender.
Now, the party machine is a, a good term to use because I feel personally like we've gotten to a point where the parties have way too much control over whether or not someone can even get involved in politics because they are the gateway to success. You can't win unless you go through one of their doors. Especially the larger the scale. And I don't necessarily think that is a good thing. And my question has always been, is that what the framers of the Constitution intended when they ratified political parties in the Constitution?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it's a question a lot of people wrestle with. The short answer is that the framers actually didn't really intend for political parties to become as powerful as they are today. In fact, many of them were pretty wary of political factions. They called them factions back then, and they kind of hoped the new republic would avoid that kind of party-driven division. But of course, parties formed pretty quickly anyway, and over time they became the central way of organizing politics. So the kind of party machinery and the gatekeeper role you're talking about wasn't really part of the original plan. It just evolved that way over time. And yeah, a lot of people today share that concern that maybe the parties have a little too much control over who gets to run and how the system works.
Are there any current candidates who are running on a reform ticket or with even rhetorically offering to fundamentally change how our political parties do business? Okay. Okay. That was fun. Oh God. Oh. Okay. So, so it looks like we don't really have a well-formed argument for not doing the stupid thing with our quote unquote two-party system that doesn't actually exist anywhere in the Constitution. So let's talk about current real impacts on the American people. How can the results of a midterm election change the direction of the country? Like, what are the stakes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I get what you're saying. It's a big topic. The two-party system isn't in the Constitution, and yet here we are. But focusing on the real impacts of midterms, they can definitely shift the direction of the country in some pretty tangible ways. The stakes are often high because midterms can change who controls Congress. If one party gains a majority, they can block or push through legislation that affects everything from healthcare to taxes to climate policy. It can shape the budget, judicial appointments, and even foreign policy stances. So a midterm can really set the legislative agenda for the next couple of years. In short, the outcome can either reinforce the president's plans if their party wins, or it can put up some big roadblocks so the opposition takes over. So the stakes are definitely real for everyday Americans.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with a question, but I want to stay on this first. What's an example of a midterm election that dramatically shifted U.S. politics?
Yeah, absolutely. One classic example that often gets brought up is the 1994 midterm elections. And that was the year when they call it the Republican Revolution, when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans took control of both the House and the Senate for the first time in decades. They ran on the Contract with America platform, and it really shifted the direction of U.S. politics. It led to a lot of changes in policy, a push for welfare reform, budget battles with the Clinton administration, and it set the tone for a more conservative legislative agenda. So that's a really strong example of midterm that had a dramatic and lasting impact on the country.
Would you say that impact was negative or positive?
Yeah, I get what you're asking there. And honestly, whether that impact was negative or positive really depends on who you ask. For folks who supported that shift, they saw it as a positive move towards smaller government, more fiscal restraint, and some policy changes they felt were overdue. On the other hand, people who disagree with that direction saw it as a negative shift that led to cuts in social programs and a more polarized political climate. So it's really a matter of perspective. Some saw it as a necessary correction. Others saw it as a step backward. It's kind of one of those moments in U.S. politics that's really viewed differently depending on where you stand.
If you were a middle class American citizen, what was your take on this?
Well, if I were putting myself in the shoes of a middle class American, I'd say the take will really depend on what mattered most to me at the time. For some middle class folks in '94, those changes might have felt like a relief. Maybe they like the idea of lower taxes or focus on reducing government spending. On the flip side, other middle class families might have been worried about losing support for education or healthcare programs they relied on. So it's kind of a mixed bag. A lot of it comes down to individual priorities and how these political shifts affected your day-to-day life. It's really about where you stood and what we needed at the time.
Okay, fair enough. I think I'm gonna keep. Okay, look, hold on. In terms of tax relief, in 1994, the tax breaks that were proposed, what level of the tax bracket did you have to be in to take advantage of those cuts?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in the mid 1990s, with that Republican-led push after the 1994 midterms, the tax relief they proposed was generally aimed at a broad range of taxpayers, but the benefits often scaled up the higher your income bracket was. Essentially, middle-class taxpayers did see some tax relief, but a lot of the more significant cuts tended to benefit those in higher income brackets. So basically, if you're middle class, you likely see some reduction in your taxes, but the higher earners often got the bigger share of the relief. It was a pretty common pattern with a lot of tax cut plans. Middle class folks got a piece of it, but the largest cuts often went to those in the upper brackets.
Okay, I get that. I think what I'm trying to get at is we've had a continual pattern of a little bit of help in terms of tax relief for the vast majority of American citizens. But while they get a little bit of help in terms of tax relief, they end up having a higher overall cost of living because those same program cuts are chopping into how much it costs for their health care, their education, their food, and everything else. So, yeah, I might make it a little bit easier come tax time, but I've been hammering you all year long, Every time you got to go to the dentist, every time you got to pay tuition, I'm killing you. And I feel like that's kind of what Newt Gingrich and those guys' legacy is. Am I completely off base?
No, I think you're hitting on a really valid point there. It's definitely a perspective that a lot of people share. Essentially, while those tax cuts might have put a little bit extra money in people's pockets, the reductions in public services or the increased cost of things like healthcare and education could have outweighed those benefits for a lot of middle class folks. So, in the bigger picture, some people do feel that the legacy of that era was a shift that might have ended up costing them more in other areas of their life. So you're not off base at all. It's a pretty common critique that the savings on taxes didn't necessarily balance out when other costs went up or when public services got scaled back. It's definitely a fair perspective.
Okay. I don't want to get because I don't want to run out of time on this, but there's something about now that concerns me given how the midterms are set up. Right now, as it stands, there are checks in place that are supposed to keep the executive branch in check, to keep them from just running roughshod across everything. And so far, the Supreme Court has seemed eager to bend over backwards to help him blow through all those checks. And my concern is, let's say the Democrats in Texas manage to stave off the gerrymandering push, and that New York and California hold on to their majorities, and we get free and fair elections in 2 years or next year in 2026, but the executive branch just ignores whatever the now Democratic-led majority Congress or House says. They ignore it. They just, because so far we've had an openly defiant executive branch just not care at all about the law in any way, shape, or form. What difference does it make if Democrats get control of the House and the Senate?
Yeah, I get where you're coming from, and that's definitely a pretty real concern a lot of people have right now. I mean, in theory, having control of Congress is supposed to mean you can act as a check on the executive branch, pass legislation, and conduct oversight. But if you're dealing with an executive branch that's basically ignoring those checks, and the Supreme Court is leaning in their favor, it can feel like the usual balance of powers is kind of out of whack. In that scenario, the difference it makes might be more about setting a political tone, creating a platform for future elections, and maybe slowing down the executive branch, even if you can't stop it entirely. It can also matter for things like funding decisions or investigations, even if those tools feel a bit weakened. So yeah, it's a tricky spot. It's not that winning control of Congress wouldn't matter at all, but it might not have the same immediate teeth if the other branches aren't playing by the usual rules.
Fair enough. Because, I mean, for years now, we've watched people be, quote unquote, hauled in front of Congress and having to testify in front of Congress. But 9 times out of 10, that's it. It's not like we saw Mark Zuckerberg testify in front of Congress and then they handcuffed him and took him to jail. You know what I mean? So I am still not 100% certain what the mechanism is that changes the game should Democrats retake the House and the Senate. I'm not saying people shouldn't work to that end, but I would be greatly reassured if you could explain how the process works and what tools they have at their disposal should they retake those two branches of government. Or that branch of government. Just sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really fair question. So if the Democrats were to retake the House and Senate, the main tools they have are essentially the legislative and oversight powers that Congress traditionally wields. So that means they can pass laws that might restrict or redirect what the executive branch is doing. They can use the power of the purse to fund or defund certain initiatives. They can conduct investigations and hearings, which, while they don't always lead to someone being handcuffed, like you mentioned, can still shine a spotlight on issues, influence public opinion, and build pressure. In terms of enforcement, it's true that Congress itself doesn't arrest people, but they can refer matters to the Department of Justice, they can impeach officials if it comes to that, and they can create legislative roadblocks that make it harder for the executive branch to just roll wild. It's not a silver bullet, and it definitely depends on the willingness to use those powers and the public support behind them. But those are the main tools they have to reassert some checks and balances if they get the majority.
Okay, help me bring it home. Why should everyday Americans care about midterms if it's not a presidential election year?
Absolutely, let's bring it home. So even though midterms aren't as flashy as a presidential election year, they're still super important because they determine who's actually running Congress and making the laws. These are the people who decide on everything from your healthcare costs to how schools are funded to what kind of environmental regulations we have. It's Congress that can really shape the direction of the country, and midterms decide who fills those seats. In other words, if you care about what's happening in your everyday life, your taxes, your local infrastructure, your rights, and the midterms of the elections, that can have a huge impact on all of that. They're your chance to have a say in who's making those day-to-day decisions that really shape the direction of the country.
Now, this question to me is why I thought we ought to have this episode. How does voter turnout in midterm elections compare to presidential elections, and why is that important?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question and really gets to the heart of it. So typically, voter turnout in midterms is quite a bit lower than in presidential elections. In a presidential election year, you might see a much larger percentage of eligible voters turning out because it's got that big national spotlight. But in midterms, the turnout tends to drop off, and that means a smaller slice of the electorate is making decisions that still affect everyone. And that's why it's important because when fewer people vote, the results can be influenced by a smaller, sometimes more motivated group that might not represent the broader population. So if more everyday Americans show up for the midterms, they get more of a say in who's representing them and how those big decisions get made.
Okay, so I think we got to paint this picture just a little bit more clearly. What percentage of the American people voted in the last presidential election? Like, at the end of the day, how when you have all the eligible voters in America, how many of them, percentage-wise, actually voted?
Yeah, so in the last presidential election in 2020, around 66% of eligible American votees actually turned out to vote. That was a really high turnout by historical standards, one of the highest in over a century. But that still means a good chunk of people didn't vote. And in midterms, that percentage tends to be even lower, usually somewhere around the mid 40% range or even less. So that's why it's so important to get people out there voting in midterms because a smaller percentage is making those big decisions.
Now, you said 60%. So that's 60% split amongst the candidates. That's not 60% to win. That's 60%, and then they split that vote to see who won the president. So just over half of the eligible voters came out to vote. And I'm not saying that to shame anyone. What I'm trying to illustrate is how that is used to create a narrative to manipulate you. Fox News wants to make you feel like MAGA is the vast majority of everyday citizens, that's most people. It's not. It's a small percentage of less than half of the people here. But the reason that they are so effective in forming public policy is reduce voter turnout. And a lot of what political parties do on both sides is to depress the vote, to make people not want to bother. Because when you have a small percentage of voters, you can manipulate and control them. The more people who get out and vote, the more power is returned to the actual voters. If you consider that 60% is a record high, that kind of informs how we got into this mess in the first place. That can't be a record high not to vote. In all of the efforts to get out the vote, to get people to vote, it has a massive difference when you cross a percentage threshold. Right now, I honestly believe our political parties don't prefer high voter turnout. Either one of them. It's easier for them to control everything if there's a few people voting. the moment you want to talk about power of the people, most people vote. We did a lot of this bullshit. I mean, that's real. And that's real. Okay, let's do our final 30 seconds. Take a quick break so I can recombobulate. Let's do our final 30 seconds. We have one more message from Standard All Everywhere Onesie. They want to express in their 30-second spot that they are available for even certain sad occasions. So give me 30 seconds for Standard All Everywhere Onesie, please.
Absolutely, let's do that. So here we go. Even in life's quieter or more solemn moments, Standard All Everywhere Onesie is there for you, whether it's a day of celebration or a moment of reflection. Our onesies bring comfort and a sense of togetherness. Because sometimes just being wrapped in something familiar helps us all feel a little more at ease. Standard All Everywhere Onesie, because comfort has no dress code, even on the hardest days. All right, there you go. You can take that, and we'll just back in whenever you're ready.
So, has the role of midterms changed in recent decades compared to earlier in U.S. history? Nova, please hit me.
Yeah, it definitely has shifted a bit. In recent decades, midterms have kind of become these big nationalized referendums on how the sitting president is doing. They've turned into these high stakes moments where both parties really try to mobilize their bases, and there's a lot more media attention on them than maybe there used to be. In the past, midterms might have been seen as a little more low key and focused on local issues. Nowadays, they're definitely more of a national event. So, yeah, the role has evolved, and they're bigger doing the political landscape than they used to be.
Okay, all right. And what impact does redistricting and gerrymandering have on midterm elections? Now, I know that certain states have their own way of doing this. Are there any current issues with gerrymandering and redistricting that are going to have an impact on the next midterm?
Yeah, absolutely. Gerrymandering and redistricting have a pretty big impact on midterms because they can shape the playing field before a single vote is even cast. Essentially, when states redraw their district lines, they can do it in a way that really favors one party, and that can lock in a certain advantage. Some states do have independent commissions to make it fair, but in other places, it's still pretty partisan. And yeah, right now there are definitely ongoing battles over gerrymandering that could affect the next midterms. Some states are still dealing with court cases about their map, and that could change how competitive certain districts are. In other words, it's definitely something that can influence who actions and won seats in the midterms.
Okay. Okay. And finally, do midterm elections face the same misinformation and polarization issues as presidential elections?
Yeah, they definitely do. Midterm elections absolutely face a lot of the same misinformation and polarization issues that presidential elections do. You've got social media spreading a lot of the same kind of rumors and false information, and you've got the same kind of partisan divides that can make it hard for people to sort out what's true. So, yeah, midterms might not get quite as much attention as a presidential election, but they're definitely not immune to all the same challenges. In fact, sometimes that lower visibility can make it even easier for misinformation to spread. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Speaking of misinformation and polarization, if you want the most accurate information concerning your midterm elections in your area, where should people go?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're looking for the most accurate info on your local midterm elections, a great place to start is your state or county election board's official website. They usually have up-to-date, reliable details on candidates, polling places, and any changes to voting procedures. You can also check out reputable nonpartisan organizations like the League of Women Voters or vote.org, which have tools to help you find accurate election info. And of course, sticking to trusted news sources and fact checkers can help you cut through some of the noise. So those are some good places to start.
Alrighty. Now, before we go, while I get prepared to drop in here and do the closing credits, um, what exactly did we learn today? Give us a quick recap of what we learned today and one final bow.
Absolutely. Let's tie it all together. So today we dove into why midterm elections matter, even though they're not in the presidential spotlight. We learned that they determine who's running Congress and shaping everyday laws, which affects everything from healthcare to education. We also talked about how midterms have become more nationalized over the years, how issues like gerrymandering get shaped the outcome, and how they face the same kind of misinformation challenges as presidential elections. In short, we covered a lot of ground on why midterms are crucial and how they really do impact everyone. So that's our big takeaway. Midterms matter and staying informed is key. And with that, we can cup it up a nice neat bowl.
All right. Well, say goodbye to the people before me, folks. Well, sorry. Say goodbye to the people before me, Nova, as we begin to head on to our hell diving mission.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in and hanging out with us. This is Nova signing off, and we're heading out on our hell diving mission. Take care, and we'll catch you next time.
All right. That's our time, and thanks for watching. It's been Over the Hilldivers.